Suggestion, or rather autosuggestion, is quite a new subject, and yet at the same time it is old as the world. It is new in the sense that until now it has been wrongly studied and in consequence wrongly understood. It is old because it dates from the appearance of man on the earth. In fact, autosuggestion is an instrument that we possess at birth, and in this instrument, or rather in this force, resides a marvelous and incalculable power, which according to circumstances produces the best or the worst results. Knowledge of this force is useful to each one of us, but is peculiarly indispensable to doctors, magistrates, lawyers, and to those engaged in the work of education. By knowing how to practice it consciously, it is possible in the first place to avoid provoking in others bad autosuggestions which may have disastrous consequence, and secondly, consciously to provoke good ones instead, thus bringing physical health to the sick and moral health to the neurotic and the erring, the unconscious victim of anterior autosuggestion, and to guide into the right path those who have a tendency to take the wrong one. In order to understand properly the phenomena of suggestion, or to speak more correctly of autosuggestion, it is necessary to know that two absolutely distinct selves exist within us. Both are intelligent, but while one is conscious and the other is unconscious. For this reason, the existence of the latter generally escapes notice. It is, however, easy to prove its existence if one merely takes the trouble to examine certain phenomena and to reflect a few moments upon them. Let us take, for instance, the following example. Everyone has heard of sleepwalking. Everyone knows that a sleepwalker gets up at night without waking, leaves his room after either dressing himself or not, goes downstairs, walks along corridors, and after having executed certain acts or accomplished certain work, returns to his room, goes to bed again, and shows next day the greatest astonishment at finding work finished, which he had left unfinished the day before. It is, however, he himself who has done it without being aware of it. What force has this body obeyed if it is not an unconscious force, in fact, his unconscious self? If we compare the consciousness with the unconscious self, we see that the conscious self is often possessed of a very unreliable memory, while the unconscious self, on the contrary, is provided with a marvelous and impeccable memory which registers, without our knowledge, the smallest events, the least important acts of our existence. Further, it is credulous and accepts with unreasoning docility what it is told. Thus, as it is the unconscious that is responsible for the functioning of all our organs, but the intermediary of the brain, a result is produced which may seem rather paradoxical to you. That is, if it believes that a certain organ functions well or ill, or that we feel such and such an impression, the organ in question does indeed function well or ill, or we do feel that impression. Not only does the unconscious self preside over the functions of our organism, but also over all our actions, whatever they are. It is this that we call imagination, and it is this which, contrary to accepted opinion, always makes us act, even and above all, against our will, when there is antagonism between these two forces. If we open a dictionary and look up the word will, we find this definition: the faculty of freely determining certain acts. We accept this definition as true and unattackable, although nothing could be more than false. This will that we claim so proudly always yields to the imagination. It is an absolute rule that admits of no exception. Blasphemy, paradox, you will exclaim. Not at all. On the contrary, it is the purest truth, I shall reply. In order to convince yourself of it, open your eyes, look around you, and try to understand what you see. You will then come to the conclusion that what I tell you is not an idle theory, offspring of a sick brain, but the simple expression of a fact. Suppose that we place on the ground a plank 30 feet long by 1 foot wide. It is evident that everybody will be capable of going from one end to the other of this plank without stepping over the edge. But now change the conditions of the experiment and imagine this plank placed at the height of the towers of a cathedral. Who then will be capable of advancing even a few feet along this narrow path? Could you hear me speak? Probably not. Before you had taken 2 steps, you would begin to tremble, and in spite of every effort of your will, you would be certain to fall to the ground. Why is it then that you would not fall if the plank is on the ground? And why should you fall if it raised to the height above the ground? Simply because in the first case you imagine that it is easy to go to the end of the plank, while in the second case you imagine that you cannot do so. Notice that your will is powerless to make you advance if you imagine that you cannot. It is absolutely impossible for you to do so. If tilers and carpenters are able to accomplish this feat, it is because they think they can do it. Vertigo is entirely caused by the picture we make in our minds that we are going to fall. As you see in each of these conflicts, it is always the imagination which gains the victory over the will, without any exception. To the same order of ideas belongs the case of the leader, who rushes forward at the head of his troops and always carries them along with him, with the cry, "Each man for himself," is almost certain to cause a defeat. Why is this? It is because in the first case, the men imagine that they must go forward, and in the second, they imagine that they are conquered and must fly for their lives. Panurge was quite aware of the contagion of example, that is to say, the action of the imagination, when, to avenge himself upon a merchant on board the same boat, he bought his biggest sheep and threw it into the sea, certain beforehand that the entire flock would follow, which indeed happened. We human beings have a certain resemblance to sheep, and involuntarily we are irresistibly impelled to follow other people's examples, imagining that we cannot do otherwise. I would quote 1,000 other examples, but I should fear to bore you by such an enumeration. I cannot, however, pass by in silence this fact which shows the enormous power of the imagination, or in other words, of the unconsciousness in its struggle against the will. Let us now return to the point where I said that we can control and lead our imagination, just as a torrent or an unbroken horse can be controlled. To do so, it is enough in the first place to know that this is possible, of which fact almost everyone is ignorant. And secondly, to know by that what means it can be done. Well, the means is very simple. It is that which we have used every day since we came into the world, without wishing or knowing it, and absolutely unconsciously, but which means, unfortunate for us, we often use it wrongly and to our own detriment. This means is autosuggestion. Whereas we constantly give ourselves unconscious autosuggestions, all we have to do is give ourselves conscious ones, and the process consists in this. First, to weigh carefully in one's mind the things which are to be the object of the autosuggestion, and according as they require the answer yes or no, to repeat several times without thinking of anything else. This thing is coming, or this thing is going away. This thing will or will not happen, etc. Of course, the thing must be in our power. If the unconscious accepts this suggestion and transforms it into an autosuggestion, the thing or things are realized in every particular. Thus understood, autosuggestion is nothing but hypnotism as I see it, and I would define it in these simple words: the influence of the imagination upon the moral and physical being of mankind. Now this influence is undeniable, and without returning to previous examples, I will quote a few others. If you persuade yourself that you can do a certain thing, provided this thing be possible, you will do it however difficult it may be. If on the contrary, you imagine that you cannot do the simplest thing in the world, it is impossible for you to do it, and molehills become for you unscalable mountains. Such is the case of neurasthenics, who believe themselves incapable of the least effort, often find it impossible even to walk a few steps without being exhausted. And these same neurasthenics sink more deeply in their depression, the more efforts to make to throw it off, like the poor wretch in the quicksand who sinks in all the deeper the more he tries to struggle out. In the same way, it is sufficient to think a pain is going, to feel it indeed disappear little by little, and inversely, it is enough to think that one suffers in order to feel the pain begin to come immediately. I know certain people who predict in advance that they will have a sick headache on a certain day, in certain circumstances, and on that day, in the given circumstance, sure enough, they feel it. They brought their illness on themselves, just as others cure theirs by conscious autosuggestion. But if our unconscious is the source of many of our ills, it can also bring about the cure of our physical and mental ailments. It can not only repair the ill it has done, but cure real illness, so strong is its action upon our organism. Shut yourself up alone in a room. Seat yourself in an armchair. Close your eyes to avoid any distractions and concentrate your mind for a few moments on thinking, such and such a thing is going to disappear, or such and such a thing is coming to pass. If you have really made the autosuggestion, that is to say, if your unconscious has assimilated the idea that you have presented to it, you are astonished to see the thing you have thought come to pass. Note that this is a property of ideas autosuggestion to exist within us unrecognized, and we know only of their existence by the effect they produce. But above all, and this is an essential point, the will must not be brought into play in practicing autosuggestion. For if it is not in agreement with the imagination, if one thinks, I will make such and such a thing happen, and the imagination says, you are willing it, but it is not going to be, not only does one not attain what one wants, but even exactly the reverse is brought about. This remark is of capital importance and explains why results are so unsatisfactory when in treating moral ailments one strives to re-educate the will. It is the training of the imagination which is necessary, and it is thanks to this shade of difference that my method has often succeeded where others, and those not the least considered, have failed. From the numerous experiments that I have made daily for 20 years, and which I have examined with minute care, I have been able to deduce the following conclusions, which I sum up as laws. 1. When the will and the imagination are antagonistic, it is always the imagination which wins, without any exception. 2. In the conflict between the will and the imagination, the force of the imagination is in direct ratio to the square of the will. 3. When the will and the imagination are in agreement, one does not add to the other, but one is multiplied by the other. And 4. The imagination can be directed. Before sending away your patient, you must tell him that he carries within him the instrument by which he can cure himself, and that you are, as it were, only a professor teaching him to use this instrument, and that he must help you in your task. Thus, every morning before rising and every night on getting into bed, he must shut his eyes and in thought transport himself into your presence, and then repeat 20 times consecutively in a monotonous voice, counting by a means of string with 20 knots in it, this little phrase: every day in every respect, I am getting better and better. In his mind, he should emphasize the words "in every respect," which applies to every need, mental or physical. This general suggestion is more effective than special ones.